Let's talk about Miriel. She's an extremely underrated character in Fire Emblem Awakening. I almost never see Miriel discussed as one of the better units in the game, and I can't say for sure exactly where I would rank her, but I can tell you that on every difficulty, including Lunatic Plus, the hardest difficulty in probably any Fire Emblem game ever made, Miriel is a very usable and worthwhile character to train and use. Now, regarding the main question of the day, can Miriel be used to replace Robin? Well, unfortunately, Robin has an extremely unique functionality that no other unit can replicate. On hard mode, you can definitely bench Robin and rely on your other units, and Miriel can be a part of this. On Lunatic mode, it's possible to play the game without using Robin, or at least using Robin very minimally. I've even done this kind of thing myself in the past. I've done Robin low usage, I'm currently doing a no Frederick challenge. People have asked if it's possible to play without Robin or Frederick, and I think that would probably not be very fun, or maybe impossible. But either way, let's stick to the topic of Miriel, because as you scale up in difficulty, something weird happens. Robin's importance as a member of the team increases drastically. This is because they have the unique capability of playing around both Aegis Plus and Pavise Plus. Check the roster. There's actually no other character who can do this early on. Additionally, Robin is arguably the only character who is suitable for 1-2 range enemy phase combat, at least for the first 5 or so chapters. You do get a very limited access to 1-2 range weapons like the Javelin and Hand Axe, and even an Orson's Hatchet if you're willing to use Renown, but the limited charges on those items forces you to be very selective with how you use them. But on the other hand, tomes are extremely spammable, and they're even cheap to replace, and they're even cheap to forge. Now, it is true that Robin and Miriel do both have access to tomes, which could make you think that they take up the same role on the team, but unfortunately, Miriel is very much lacking in bulk. She can't enemy phase more than 1 unit typically until much later on, basically not until after her promotion. Not only that, but on Lunatic mode, some enemies have the stats to just one-round Miriel. You need to use a good parrot partner to give her defense so she doesn't immediately fold. However, you might not always have that unit available that you want to use. Remember, this game doesn't take place in a spreadsheet. I'm very fond of this saying. The game takes place in a real battle with real conditions. Sometimes you need someone to block an enemy, and maybe Kellam is currently paired up with Frederick, or you can't give him to Miriel for some other reason. In situations like that, Robin's ability to take a single hit from any enemy archer without getting one shot is extremely valuable, because no other character can replicate that role on the team. On Lunatic Plus, this becomes even more pronounced. A Saul or Kellam pair-up might keep Miriel alive consistently on Lunatic, so you could develop methods to always train her on every playthrough very consistently. But on Lunatic Plus, those same enemies could have Aegis Plus, making it less possible for Miriel to chip them, and less useful for her to enemy phase them. It's better in those situations to use a character like Robin who can potentially bait in 1 or 2 dual strikes from Chrom. Dual strikes play around Aegis Plus, and Robin can even switch to a sword, depending on the enemy, to deal even more damage, something that Miriel just can't do. Now, even worse is the fact that enemies can sometimes roll Luna Plus, and in some situations, even with a defense pair-up, Miriel will still drop to a single attack. So you can roll configurations where it becomes impossible to train her. You cannot reliably create scenarios where it's always 100% safe to train Miriel, because the conditions of the battle are just going to be different every single time you play it. And she, unfortunately, she's just on that line where if the enemies roll a certain skill, she can't fight them safely anymore, and there's nothing you can do about it. So unfortunately, having tried to make this work several times, I can pretty confidently say that Miriel does not replace Robin's functionality. Around 2 months ago, I was having a conversation with another Fire Emblem YouTuber named Blue, and he might not even remember this, but during the conversation we were having, he suggested that I try to go all in on Miriel or all in on Ricken in order to replace Robin's functionality. Like, say for example, if you wanted to do a no Robin challenge, or if you just wanted to switch Robin over to a sword-locked class. It's an idea that I was working on, and it was so interesting to me that I really wanted to try it out. And for over 2 months, I've been doing several playthroughs, I've been doing research, I've been doing Lunatic Plus and Lunatic Mode gameplay, trying to solve this issue, and I just keep running into the same problem over and over again. Robin and Miriel do work very well together. You can make space for both of them on the team. Having 2 tome users is great, but you just can't remove the functionality of the tactician class and replace it with Miriel, or Ricken really. Miriel doesn't have enough bulk, and Ricken doesn't have enough speed or enough bulk. Even if Ricken joined at Miriel's join time, he still wouldn't be able to do what Robin can do. If you try to rely on just Miriel, you're going to to make Chapter 4 significantly harder, Side Story 1 is going to be significantly harder, and honestly, at first, the idea seems like it has some merit, and it's going to feel like it could be possible, because Miriel actually makes up the difference in these two chapters in a way. She actually helps you beat these chapters when you're not using Robin. Or especially if you're willing to use Robin minimally alongside Miriel, it feels pretty good. But then you get to Chapter 5, and I felt like my run was basically soft-locked every single time, no matter what I did, no matter what I tried. Without a properly trained Robin to help mitigate the incoming enemy forces, I just get overwhelmed no matter what I try, and no matter what opening I use, no matter what strategy I use. Even if I reset over and over again to get as lucky as possible, there's just no way to defeat the opening groups of enemies. You need Frederick and Robin both trained properly to fight in Chapter 5 on two different fronts, and there's no other character who can do this. Doing it with Frederick and Miriel does not work. And keep in mind, on my best possible attempts, I was even still trying to use both Robin and Miriel, but with that Miriel focus, and in those situations, my Robin was just a little bit too weak to deal with the enemies, and even that causes the map to just become impossible to beat. Now, having said all of that, while Miriel cannot replace the functionality of Robin, she shines in her own way. Miriel is her own unique unit, and she brings extremely high value to the team building dynamic. What she contributes is different from what Robin contributes, so you have to think about them in a different way. Not only is her contribution valuable on Lunatic mode, but she's one of those units, like Virion, who becomes even better on Lunatic Plus. So how could that be true given everything that I just said? Well, I'm going to repeat some of those statements, but in a different way. Miriel doesn't replace the functionality of Robin. Instead, what she does is contribute the same kind of role as someone like Virion. Miriel is a player phase chip damage unit, but examining all of the unique facts above, she actually has more potential that Virion lacks. She can do many things that Virion cannot do. So in a way, sort of like Robin, there is no other character who can replace the functionality of early game Miriel. Because in the early game, you have a surprisingly small number of units who are capable of bypassing Pavise Plus. If a specific enemy unit rolls Pavise Plus and it's a character that you needed to remove, your choices, basically, well, number one, you could just reset the game, I guess. I hate doing this. And honestly, I hate Pavise and Aegis in the early game so much. You guys have no idea. But if you've watched my streams, you've probably heard me ranting about how much I think Aegis and Pavise are actually significantly worse designed skills. They're harder to deal with, they're less fun, they're more unfairly difficult, even compared to Counter, which is often considered the most hated skill in the entire game. I genuinely believe Aegis and Pavise are worse than Counter, because you have several methods for playing around Counter, even early on. But if the wrong enemy rolls Pavise, later on in the game, sure, you're going to have more units and more tactics available to play around that. But honestly, this early, you have nothing. IS adding Pavise Plus and Aegis Plus to the game as early as Chapter 3 is just nuts to me. I would probably not have added them to the Lunatic Plus skill pool until at least Chapter 6 or 7. Chapter 5 I would be okay with. It feels like it kind of works at that point in the game, although I still firmly believe that Aegis Plus and Pavise Plus are the biggest reasons why Chapter 3 and Chapter 5 are absolute run killers and why they are so reset heavy on Lunatic Plus. Chapter 3 is just unacceptable. If Frederick needs to kill an enemy in that chapter and he can't do it, you basically have to reset the game. But I'm not going to rant about that too much, okay? Let's talk about the methods you do have to play around it, at least this early on. So the number 2 option is to overpower the enemy with repeated attacks, and this can work if it's just one enemy, but you have to dedicate 4 or 5 units to bringing down just one enemy. If there's a group, this becomes significantly less possible and more unwieldy and more clunky. Also, if the enemy rolls the dreaded combination of Pavise Plus and Counter, you're basically frying your entire team with reflected chip damage into lethal range just to take down one enemy. And then whatever else is coming next is going to wipe out all of your units. At the very least, it's going to be impossible to make it so they can't take out at least one of your characters. So number 3, which is basically your only actually true option this early in the game, is to chip the enemy down with either magic or bows before you finish them off. And for that, you have 3 characters: Robin, Miriel, and Virion. That's it. There's nobody else. Now, Virion is accurate and bows hit pretty hard, but unfortunately, he is slow, and most enemies at this point in the game have more defense than they have resistance, which makes him a little bit worse. I'm not going to discount his contributions. He's good as a chip damage unit, and honestly, he's great as a pair-up unit. On top of that, he can even do something that's exclusive to bows and is very valuable in Lunatic Plus, so there are advantages that he has over Miriel and Robin. The fact that using a bow turns off your one range counter makes it so that he is never affected by enemies with the counter skill. Miriel can't do this, Robin can't do this. If you need Virion to chip or kill an enemy, but leave him in range of a second enemy with counter, well, two things. Number one, Virion is actually pretty bulky, so he's probably going to live one hit. Then, on the other hand, because he has a bow equipped, he's not going to counterattack, and so he's not going to take counter damage. This means that he is far more likely to survive as a blocker after doing chip damage. So Virion is sort of a crossover between a blocker and a chip damage unit, while Miriel is a pure chip damage unit. In Virion's case, you're going to sometimes lose a bit of momentum when you use him in this way, but that is better than getting a game over. So now we got to talk about Miriel versus Robin. We've already discussed all of the reasons why Robin is better at 1-2 range enemy phase compared to Miriel, but let's talk about how they compare as 2-range player phase units, because that's where Miriel really shines. If you need a character to chip an enemy, whether it's because they have Pavise Plus, or just a lot of defense and bulk, who is better to use, Robin or Miriel? First of all, we're going to talk about opportunity cost, because there's a lot of different things that Robin could be doing instead, and for that reason, having Miriel do this actually frees up Robin to do other things. So in a weird way, indirectly, the better Robin is, it also means the better Miriel is, because she is always freeing up a better unit to take other, more important actions. Now, on the other hand, statistically, I'm not a huge fan of side-by-side numerical unit comparisons. The reason is because, as I've already said once in this video, and I'm probably going to continue to say this again and again, as long as I keep making videos, this game does not take place in a spreadsheet. It takes place in a real battle with real battlefield conditions. Really, who cares if Stahl can deal 2 more damage than Sully? If both of them defeat the enemy after the enemy has been chipped by Miriel or Virion, their difference in damage means absolutely nothing. They are effectively equal in terms of offense in like 9 out of 10 cases. Now, getting that disclaimer out of the way, I do acknowledge that a character with higher attack and higher speed in a wider variety of situations will be able to get the job done more consistently and more often, especially when you're factoring in things like Aegis Plus and Pavise Plus. You can't always know for sure how bulky a Lunatic Plus enemy is going to be. In some cases, they could have double their normal effective bulk thanks to Aegis Plus or Pavise Plus. And in situations like that, every point of magic and every point of speed does matter. Now, Robin in particular, though, is very difficult to compare in a unit versus unit basis, because they have several factors that work very strongly in their favor and are difficult to account for. Number one, they have a ton of opportunities to pick up uncontested experience before almost every other unit has joined the army. And in the first 6 or 7 chapters, there are still so many things that only Robin can do. They're going to continue to pick up uncontested experience unless you are intentionally going out of your way not to use Robin. Combine this with veteran, and they will tend to be at a higher level when you compare them against another unit. So you can't really say level 10 Robin versus level 10 Vaike or level 10 Miriel, because typically there's going to be a level difference. Still, when I was planning out these runs, I updated my own personal spreadsheet anyway, and I simulated the stats of Miriel, Robin, and Ricken because I wanted to compare all 3 of them. So I'm going to quickly mention that I think Ricken is the worst of the 3 units. You barely even need to talk about the reasons why, but number 1, he can't enemy phase as well as Robin, and number 2, he can't player phase as well as Robin or Miriel. His one saving grace is that he joins with a few levels already and D rank and tomes already, so you kind of get him for free and you don't need to train him like you would need to train Miriel or train Robin, but this happens so early on in the game that there's a very minor difference between them, and he's basically still the same. He's still an untrained growth unit. He does have one other advantage in the fact that his magic stat is pretty high and he hits pretty hard, so if you need somebody to one-shot a unit, Ricken could be the better option. But let's talk about the case that matters a lot more, Robin versus Miriel. So here's the basic idea. Robin is always going to be way more bulky. We've discussed this before, we discussed it above, but let's talk about offense. My favorite Robin build, which uses plus defense and minus luck, if you train both Robin and Miriel to level 10, which I know isn't a 100% fair comparison, but let's just talk about it. Miriel is going to be 2 points faster on average. She's going to have 1 extra point of skill for better accuracy and crits. Not only that, but you could actually have her stand next to Robin and use his solidarity bonus to get plus 10 crit. So she actually has a pretty big advantage in terms of crit potential because Robin doesn't benefit from his own solidarity bonus. I haven't got around to making my high variance video yet, and I'm probably going to do a Lonq highlight at some point soon, maybe even in my next showcase video. But anyway, let's get to the really big, the very important fact. In terms of magic, Miriel has a staggering +4 magic lead. So she's more likely to double, and she's attacking twice, which is going to be an extra 8 points of damage ahead of Robin, on top of the fact that she crits more often. There's no question that a trained Miriel is much more effective at chipping down and removing those annoying Pavise Plus enemies. She's also going to lower the health of fighters, mercenaries, thieves, dark mages, and several other enemy types. By lowering their health to a specific point, Frederick or someone else can run in and defeat them with a single attack. Being able to one-shot an enemy is very key on Lunatic Plus. Not only does it stop them from hitting you in return, but it also prevents you from taking any counter damage. So Miriel heavily contributes as a unit to help you play around counter. Her role in the group ends up being so important. If you don't train Miriel properly, if you just leave her on the bench, you're going to constantly get this nagging feeling that the enemy forces are just too bulky and you have no way to deal with them. You're going to be getting overwhelmed by enemies with Pavise and counter, and you just can't shake the feeling. Even if you're utilizing Robin, it can be tough for Robin to do all the work on their own. Having just that one extra unit to help with player phase removal, arguably, I would say Miriel is the best player phase chip unit in the early game. I think she outshines Ricken, I think she outshines Virion, I even think she outshines Robin. But you have to train her to get this value, unlike Robin, who is going to be constantly picking up uncontested experience. Now, I know what all of you are thinking, and I know what you're about to say. Well, what about plus speed Robin? This is the one that every other player other than me prefers. Well, maybe not that extreme, but either way. Well, funny enough, even a plus speed Robin is only 1 point of speed faster than Miriel on average, and they're still 4 points behind in magic. Now, I will admit speed is a very important offensive stat, but Miriel is fast enough. So giving up 4 points of attack, effectively 8 points of damage for just 1 point of speed, comparing them to an already fast character, it doesn't look great. Lastly, I also simulated a plus magic Robin just to see how things look, and man guys, it is bad. After looking at this, I don't think I would ever run a plus magic Robin, no matter what anyone tells me. Plus magic Robin is slower than Miriel, he has less skill, and amazingly, he still has 1 less point of magic than Miriel on average. This really highlights Robin's unit identity. They are supposed to be a mixed attacker with good bulk, and no matter which asset and which flaw you pick, they're always going to be tied to that identity. Even the plus magic Robin is a little bit less magical and a little bit more bulky compared to Miriel. On that note, here's a funny piece of trivia. If you train both units all the way up and you cap their magic stat, the plus magic Robin is still going to have 4 less points of magic compared to Miriel, because not only is her magic cap 2 points higher even than a plus magic Robin, but she has the magic +2 skill on top of that. Robin likely is not going to have that skill. And this really highlights Miriel's unit identity. She is a fast magical attacker. Now, if you've ever played Pokemon before, you might understand why Miriel's stats can be considered better than Robin's, in a certain context, at least for the role that she wants to do in the game. Having 150 special attack and 150 speed, while removing all of your points from attack, defense, and HP, can often be a much better Pokemon compared to one who has a balanced set of stats across the board, because all you need for that Pokemon to do is to switch in, outspeed the opponent, and defeat them with a single powerful attack. You don't need points in HP, attack, or defense to do that. Miriel is just like that. She follows the same principle. She gives up the idea of having a balanced stat spread, but in exchange, her stats are heavily optimized to do one thing and one thing very well. She hits fast, and she hits hard. Even her level 1 Mage skill, Magic +2, makes her better designed at this role. She is a fantastically designed unit. She does everything to min-max her stats and get the most out of her unit identity. This concept of dumping unwanted stats and maximizing your core stats goes back probably as far as gaming has existed. It's known in Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop games as a dump stat. So yeah, looking purely at Miriel as a player phase chip unit, she is probably the best, at least this early on. She's not going to one-shot enemies the way that Frederick can with the Silver Lance, but with a speed pair-up, she can double almost anything and hit them twice super hard, as long as you train her just a little bit. And the more you train her, the better she will become. Now, I think if I wanted to explore this idea of having her truly replace Robin, not just replacing Virion or Ricken as your chip damage unit to play around Pavise Plus, the goal would be to train her to level 10 as soon as possible and basically hopefully rely on getting an early master seal from one of Anna's shops. If you could early promote her to a Dark Knight, she would become a somewhat functional replacement for Robin. I don't think she's going to be as good, but in theory it gives her all of the same things. A bit of bulk to survive attacks, hard-hitting double attacks at 1-2 range, and even Robin's unique ability to switch to swords and tomes for playing around both defensive enemy skills. I think this map, Chapter 5 in particular, is still going to be very difficult, but I think it might be possible to beat under those conditions. Definitely on Lunatic, and maybe even on Lunatic Plus, but I never got a run going so far where I met all of those conditions. Truthfully, there are so many things you can do with Miriel, and she is a very unique unit in the fact that almost any choice is going to lead to a good build. She is very, very easy to use as a character. She's not very difficult to train, and we haven't even gotten into her value beyond player phase chip damage and enemy removal, because she has other things that she can do. She picks up other skills and other talents over time. There are so many other roles you can do with Miriel, and she's shockingly good at almost everything that you want her to do. A couple of these traits only get highlighted and only become better on Lunatic Plus style play. All of this plays into what I said at the start of the video, how Miriel becomes better and better the more you scale up the difficulty. So first, let's talk about why Miriel is easy to train. She shares a lot of the same qualities that Robin has, the same things that make him or her easy to train, and while Miriel doesn't have as much uncontested experience, and she doesn't have all of those same situations where quote-unquote only Robin can do this, if you want to train Miriel, you can make those opportunities happen. Now, I personally think tomes are probably the easiest weapon type to train with, at least in the early game. Bows are likely up there on the list too, but the inability to counter at one range can be seen as a flaw when you're trying to train a unit, because it reduces the number of situations where you can pick up experience during enemy phase combat. But the real value is just that access to 2 range, spammable 2 range, being able to attack over and over again 45 times, 90 times with a cheap weapon that you can infinitely restock, not those limited 25 javelins and 25 hand axes that you get early on, but you can't buy any replacements until later. No. Not only do you have cheap wind tomes, but another awesome feature of the tome class is the variance at each level. Swords basically only have a bronze sword. Bows have a bronze bow. All of the other weapons are basically the same. Only tomes are different. They have 3 different types of tomes at every level, so you have wind, fire, and thunder available. You could carry one of each tome and tailor your attacking needs based on how much accuracy you need or how much damage you need for what you're trying to do. This versatility makes it easier to set up combats for Miriel and makes her more reliable when a combat has been set up for her. Now let's take a look at axes by comparison. Now, I'm not trying to downplay axe units or the weapon class as a whole. I actually personally think that axes are the best weapon type in Awakening. However, they are among the hardest to train with in the early game. Because the damage of axes is rather high, it could be easy to set up a kill for someone like Vaike. If you only need to damage the enemy down to 16 health, and then Vaike could finish them off with one big attack, on the surface, this seems very appealing. It seems like he would be a very easy unit to train, and it can be alluring. You have to compare this against someone like Crom, who's going to require you to chip the same enemy down to like 10 health or even 8 health to be able to finish them off, looking at the difference in weapon might, strength, and other factors. But the issue you have to balance is how easy it is to set up a kill versus how reliable is that attack. And unfortunately, with an iron axe, you've got a couple of problems. Number one, you have to walk up to the enemy and actually attack them. Your attack is going to be less accurate. If it misses, in some situations, it's pretty scary to risk this because it could instantly lead to a game over. The enemy could kill you on the counterattack. Even if that's not the case, now you're injured and you're blocking the tile that your ally wants to move into. This doesn't always matter, but sometimes it does. So you have to think, what percentage of the time are those situations coming up where the axe is causing problems? Also, because you're one space further forward, it's now more likely that you're in range of a second enemy or a third enemy or a whole group of enemies. They could run in and finish you off on enemy phase. Now, Vaike in particular has good bulk, and this can make it so that even if he misses an attack, he's not necessarily always going to immediately die. You could also set up situations where he waits to fight on enemy phase, so if he misses, it doesn't cost his own action. You can adapt your player phase based on whether he hit or missed, but doing all of this complicates things and it makes the training less reliable, especially if you're trying to do things 20 or 30 minutes into a battle. And all of the strengths that I described are unique to Vaike. These are reasons why Vaike is good. It doesn't change the fact that the weapon class itself, the axe weapon class, is difficult to train. It just so happens to be the case that Vaike is a well-designed and strong unit who has the tools to mitigate the problems with the axe units. But still, even Vaike is not going to completely remove the downsides of training through the axe class. Now, by comparison, let's look at tomes, because they circumvent almost every single issue that I just discussed. The Wind Tome is insanely accurate, the Fire Tome is pretty accurate, and the Thunder Tome, even still, is slightly more accurate than an Iron Axe. But Miriel, on top of that, has a lot of skill, and you don't even always need the Thunder Tome to set up kills. So remember, the versatility of tomes allows you to switch between Wind if you need accuracy over firepower, or Thunder if you need firepower over accuracy. And oftentimes, the enemies have one clear strength and one clear weakness that you can exploit. Most enemies are either dodgy or have high resistance. Not both. Very few enemies in the early game even have high resistance to begin with, much less having high resistance and avoid. You're going to be surprised how often the One Might Wind Tome just gets the job done, with Miriel's high base magic stat. You could say it's a little bit harder to set up a kill for Miriel, because you need to get to the enemy to a specific and often slightly lower HP value, but once you have set up that kill, Miriel will almost never miss, and this means there is no risk in training her. You just have to think a little bit harder to set up those opportunities for her to fight. But you can always count on the fact that she will always hit, she will always get the experience, she will always get the kill. And again, 20 or 30 minutes into a battle, this matters. The difference might be subtle, but in my opinion, having played the game over and over again on the hardest difficulties, I really do think this is a more valuable trait to have on a trainee unit. That consistency. The ability to guarantee that an action will succeed and help avoid annoying resets 20 minutes into the game. On top of all that, after Miriel attacks, she's going to be one square further back. This makes it less likely that she's in range of a second enemy, a third enemy, or a whole group. And you're also going to have 3 or even more options for where to stand when you're lining up your attack angles. And if for some reason she does make a risky attack and she misses, in a lot of those cases, at least against melee enemies, even if she does miss, she doesn't take any counter damage anyway, the enemy can't counterattack her, and the space in front of the opponent is still open, so you could still have Vaike move in to take a second risky attack against the same enemy, because Miriel is not blocking the square in front of them. For all of these reasons and more, I think Miriel can actually be very, very easy to train. Trying to set up kills for her in Chapter 2 can be an absolute headache, I'll admit, but I've managed to do that even on Lunatic Plus, and she has so many free opportunities to get experience in Chapter 3, even if you didn't manage to train her in Chapter 2. Even better is that when you get to Chapter 4, when you get to Side Story 1, especially when you get to Chapter 5, a properly trained Miriel is going to be taking essential actions to help you clear out enemies. At that point, she's not even a trainee unit anymore. You are not training her. She is just gaining experience as a result of contributing to the battle in a genuinely impactful and needed role for the team. The next best thing about Miriel that I want to discuss is that she is such a beginner-friendly unit, even after training her. Now, optimally, of course, you want to go into the game with a specific plan in mind for what to do, and experienced players are often going to be able to make the most out of Miriel, or any other unit for that matter, if they use a second seal or a master seal at the right time for a specific reason with a specific plan in their mind. But on the other hand, new players might not always know exactly what to do. They might be scared about making the wrong choice. But here, there is no wrong choice. There are just a few units in the game, like Miriel, where I really have to highlight the fact that her class set is phenomenal. As soon as Miriel gets to level 10, you could make a solid argument for using any second seal or master seal option in her entire set. And every single case is going to result in a version of Miriel that is very usable, continues to be very easy to train, and continues to contribute to your army immediately. She never resets into a weaker version of herself. Like Donald, for example, has a major problem, where you train him for 10 levels, training his lance rank the entire time, and then he resets to either a sword or axe using class, and he needs to start training his weapon rank all the way from E all over again. Donald is one of the most extreme cases, but Pan and Noe have a similar issue, even if they are better units. On the subject of Miriel, though, the thing I want to highlight is that she does not have this problem, and characters who can avoid this problem are very strong in this game, in a no-grinding context. No matter what option you use for the second or the master seal, Miriel never switches into a character who is forced to train using an E-rank weapon. So let's examine all of her options. First of all, the second seals. Now, I will say, you only get a few second seals early on, and they are heavily contested. I'm not even a person who likes using second seals very much, and even in my case, I think in my typical routing, I always leave notes for what I would do with 2 or 3 additional second seals, beyond the one that you get guaranteed. However, that's a different conversation. Let's think about your favorite food of all time. Now imagine it costs 10 times as much. This isn't going to change how good the food tastes, it's not going to change how much you enjoy it, it's just going to change whether or not you think it's worth that price. Second seals being contested is the same thing. It's different from whether or not Miriel's alternate classes are good. They're definitely good, they're very good, but you have to decide for yourself, based on the context of what you're trying to do, based on your team, the other characters you're training, whether it is worth the cost of using one of your guaranteed second seals, or if you get a lucky Anashop second seal if you want to use it on Miriel, as like your second, third, or fourth option. Her alternate class options are Dark Mage and Troubadour. Going through the Dark Mage line essentially just allows Miriel to keep doing what she was already doing and train for an extra 10 or even 20 levels before promoting. It can sometimes be good to do this if you don't have enough master seals early on, rather than allowing Miriel to ram into the level 20 cap at some point, or just floundering around for a while before you eventually promote her anyway. What you could do is just have her continue to spend more training levels in a more productive way. Going through this Dark Mage line, she's going to pick up Hex and Anathema, which are both top tier skills in this game. Hex works very similar to Heartseeker, if you're familiar with that skill from the Fates games. When Miriel is standing beside an enemy, it's going to lower their avoid. This allows you to use less accurate weapons and dish out more damage without giving up consistency, and it even helps her allies. But where the Dark Mage class really shines is their access to Anathema. This aura is incredible. It's one of my favorite skills of all time. Not only does it have an awesome 3-tile range, allowing Miriel to debuff enemies just by standing anywhere near them, not even needing to get close enough to attack herself. And on top of that, it works when she's standing in the rear guard position as part of a pair-up. Well, Anathema reduces their avoid even further, making enemies even easier to hit. Then, on top of all of that, it lowers their crit avoid. Crit strategies are probably at their best in Awakening for general play compared to any other game in the series. It's easier to make builds that get extremely consistent crit rates. But on top of that, it's also easier to just get naturally really high crit on your normal character builds. Well, adding another 10 points of crit on top of all of those normal crit strategies just makes them even better. I've also talked about how I personally like high variance strategies because they can be used as a solid bailout option to avoid otherwise guaranteed game overs in Lunatic Plus. Increasing your bailout chance by 10% is never a bad thing, and it can even help with Lunatic play or even hard mode play if you're doing Iron Man or if you're just not the kind of person who makes a perfect plan every time. From Dark Mage, she could still promote directly into Dark Knight, which we're going to talk about later, and she could also go into Sorcerer to keep access to Dark Tomes. The other awesome thing about Dark Mage and the Sorcerer is their access to this Dark Magic option. The Flux Tome is more powerful than any other E-rank tome, even stronger than Thunder, but it's relatively cheap for how strong it is. It has more might than Thunder, but it's still cheaper. Because forge cost is dependent on the price of your weapon, this makes it even more efficient to forge a Flux Tome compared to a Thunder Tome, and because these tomes have 45 charges, you are going to get a ton of long-term value out of this forge. After that, we gotta talk about Nosferatu. If you're a Fates player, you probably already know that this tome is really good. Well, actually, it was so powerful in Awakening that it was heavily nerfed going into Fates. and it's still really, really strong in Fates. So just imagine how much better it is in this game. Miriel gaining access to Nosferatu solves a lot of her bulk problems. In this game, you can double with Nosferatu, you can crit, it doesn't weigh you down, it doesn't stop you from activating skills. The only downside is just having to obtain or buy more copies of Nosferatu, and most shops are not going to sell it early on, so your early supply is going to be fairly limited. However, people fall into this trap of thinking that their Dark Mage needs to have Nosferatu equipped all the time, and that's not really the case. You can just have them use Flux or Thunder or even Wind like 99% of the time, and then just use Nosferatu for that one situation to avoid being killed. Talking briefly again about Lunatic Plus, it is worth mentioning that Nosferatu can directly play around counter, because you heal yourself before you take counter damage. And this is very important. They're probably the best and most consistent class for playing around counter. If all of that wasn't enough, you even get access to a special tome called Aversa's Knight, which is just a version of Nosferatu with super high attack power. Like, it has basically the same might as a silver axe, but it heals you for half damage. Imagine if a silver axe healed you when you attacked with it. That would be crazy. You can do this with Soul, but Soul doesn't activate 100% of the time. Nosferatu and Aversa's Knight both do. Just close your eyes and imagine the super fast, hard-hitting Miriel going into the Dark Mage class. Just picture that and how awesome it would be. Because, well, you know what? It's actually possible. She just naturally has that in her class set, and it's very easy for her to pick up those skills. Oh, also, there's the infamous Meyer Tome, which allows you to snipe enemies from 3 to 10 spaces away. Alright, Fire Emblem 6 players, I'm talking to you right now. Remember long-range status staves? Remember siege tomes? Wasn't it really, really annoying when enemies were spamming those against you? Well, now it's time to turn the tables, because Miriel is the unit on your army who can blast the enemy forces from halfway across the map. The amount of broken nonsense in this game is a truly beautiful thing, and Miriel is one of the fortunate characters who has innate access to Dark Mage, which gets some of the best stuff. She is living proof that you do not need Gale Force to be a good unit. Now, let's talk about Troubadour. It's a common beginner trap to think that staff-locked classes aren't very good, they're very difficult and slow to train, and maybe this is somewhat true in the older games, although I think a lot of what I'm about to say here does apply to the older games as well. I personally think that staff classes are actually the easiest to train out of, and they're some of the most valuable characters on your team. Now, you might be thinking this is a contradiction, because earlier I said that tomes were the easiest weapon type to train. Well, that is true, but that's the beauty of staff classes. They do not need a weapon to train. You just train your character by using your staff. Miriel will never need to fight anything while training back out of the Troubadour class, and this is very important. It reduces the need to keep setting up complicated situations for Miriel to fight. You don't need to worry about her fighting dangerous enemies. She just needs to heal an ally every turn, and she will steadily gain experience. Furthermore, the experience is almost completely uncontested because staff users aren't leeching experience from combat. Unless you're training multiple staff users, it basically means that Miriel can steadily continue to level herself up without taking away any experience from Frederick, Robin, Crom, Vaike, Sumia, nobody. She's basically just competing with Lisa and Maribel. Furthermore, the amount of staff experience you get in Awakening is very good, so this speeds up the process even more. I don't think I would ever consider replacing Lisa with Miriel. However, in runs where I need a second staff user, there is some serious merit to the idea of at least taking into consideration using a trained Miriel, switching her into Troubadour, and using her on your team instead of picking up Maribel. Her high magic stat is going to give her more range on her rescue and ward staves, it's going to give her more healing on her healing staves, and she's going to have 9 or more levels worth of bulk that are going to help her survive if she absolutely needs to soak an enemy attack, in situations where Maribel just couldn't do it. The Troubadour class also gives access to a few good skills. Resistance +2 is not super highly rated, but it will add to the stack of qualities that make her good at mage versus mage combat in the mid to late game, so it's not nothing. Demoiselle is a bit better. It's like the defensive version of Anathema. It makes your other units within 3 tiles better at dodging, which is actually very good in this game, and it also gives them 10 crit avoid, which is actually extremely good in this game. You can turn an enemy's 7% crit rate into a 0% crit rate. You essentially remove the option of an unlucky game over just by having Miriel stand near your other characters. Because of that 3 range radius, it's very easy to use, even with defensive positionings, Unfortunately, weird decision making here, but for some reason it only applies to male allies, and in this game, unlike Fates, there's not even the opposite version that affects female units, so yeah, Demoiselle is the only one, and it only buffs males. I have no idea why they did this, but even with that restriction, it's still quite useful, and it's still worth going out of your way to get it, in my opinion. From Troubadour, you could promote into Valkyrie or War Cleric, and this is important because you normally can't access either of those classes from Mage. So if you do want to promote directly into Valkyrie, you have to go through Troubadour. Miriel actually has a perfect set of base classes to give her access to all 5 of the master classes in the magical set. So while we're on the subject of second seals, no matter how or when you choose to promote Miriel, what's really cool is that after she has been trained and promoted, she can later eventually use a second seal to switch into any of the top tier mage classes. Sorcerer, Dark Knight, Sage, War Cleric, Valkyrie, all of these classes are available to her. Unfortunately, while War Cleric is a great class, it's probably the worst option for Miriel specifically. It doesn't make good use of any of the things that Miriel is actually good at, and Miriel's not really good at any of the things that the War Cleric wants to do. It's more of a bulky enemy phase class that happens to have staff access. Miriel appreciates the staff access from some of the other classes, but she's more of a player phase attacker who could double as utility, and she doesn't want to be locked to using axes. In order to talk more about her other promoted classes, we have to talk about Master Seal usage. So going back a few steps, in a no-grinding context, with limited access to second seals, you might not have the opportunity to switch Miriel over to Dark Mage or Troubadour early. But honestly, even this is completely fine. Miriel is just one of those types of units who gets a lot of value out of early promotion, and she gets all of the benefits that come with early promotion. She's going to get a huge immediate power spike if you consider her as one of your early Master Seal candidates. Now, there is an opportunity cost here. You only get a few Master Seals guaranteed. It's more than the second seals, but honestly, still not a lot. I often find myself wanting like 7 Master Seals before I go into Chapter 12 if I look at my character notes, and you only get 3 of them guaranteed, and Anna is probably not going to show up that many times. So it's really up to you to decide where Miriel falls on your priority list. Is she going to get the first Master Seal? Probably not usually. Maybe the 3rd or 4th. Waiting until after Chapter 12 where you can buy infinite Master Seals can also still be workable. She's not going to fall too far behind. But anyway, if you are going to promote her immediately, she's going to be going from Mage directly into either Dark Knight or Sage. Now, Sage. This is going to give her immediate staff access, which is actually going to allow her to train herself for free, and she gets better overall stats for what she was already doing as a mage. Essentially, it makes a stronger version of Miriel that you're already using, but it gives her access to one of the best extra tools in the game. Awakening stabs are all-time best among the Fire Emblem franchise. It's funny because there's actually only a few stabs in this game, but it's crazy how big of an impact they have on the meta. Gaining access to those stabs is truly a powerful asset, and it's such a beginner-friendly option in this case. Most people they're just going to pick Sage promotion for Miriel if they didn't know what they were doing, purely on instinct, and they happen to get what could arguably be her best early game promotion. You will very quickly get Rally Magic, which you can use to make your other magic-using units hit harder. This gives Miriel even more of a utility niche, and even better, as you train her, she's going to eventually get Tome Fair, an awesome +5 damage stack skill, which is going to make her attacks hit even harder, which is something she was already very good at. I swear, if you look at things this way, it almost feels like the Sage class in this game was designed for Miriel, and balanced with her in mind as a unit. She is such a well-constructed unit. From the perspective of a game designer, I really, really appreciate how much of her kit is so intuitive for players to use, and how every single aspect of her build either contributes to what she wants to do, or adds utility value to the team as a whole with no opportunity cost. It's really beautiful game design, and I just have to sit there and appreciate it. But don't discount the Dark Knight class either. The skills here are not worth it. Sword access probably doesn't help Miriel very much, but the value of the Dark Knight promotion is going to be the added mobility and stats. I experimented with this recently in my No Frederick challenge run, and she really blew my expectations out of the water. Miriel becomes surprisingly bulky in this class, although the skills you get from Dark Knight are truly unfortunate. Slow Burn has got to be the worst hit evade skill skill in the entire game. It gives a measly single-digit bonus during the early turns of the map when it matters the most, and by the time the skill ramps up to the full bonus, the battle is likely long over. And even worse, if the battle continues past 15 turns, your slow burn bonus disappears instantly and completely. I have no idea how they thought this was equally balanced with quick burn, because it is clearly much, much worse. Life Taker isn't a completely terrible skill, but it's typically not worth investing 15 levels into Dark Knight just to pick up this skill. Healing yourself after killing an enemy actually does have some value. If it worked on enemy phase, it would be an incredible skill, but it is a player phase exclusive tool, and it has fairly niche applications as a result. Mostly, it allows Miriel a little bit of a safety net when she's removing enemies on player phase, because when she's deciding what position she wants to end her turn in, she can take into account that she's going to have a little bit more health, which might improve her survivability in some cases. I don't think Miriel is the best candidate for the Dark Knight class. There are characters who can perform better in this role, but it is at least worth considering the Dark Knight class for Miriel. I don't think it's an unusable class line, and like I said, it actually far exceeded my expectations for how I thought she would perform. With the right parrot partner, you can genuinely use Miriel to body block 2 or even 3 enemies, and that has some serious value. You can protect objectives, you can seize goals, you can get items. Additionally, in the Dark Knight class, she's going to get more and more bulky over time, but I do want to finish up my No-Frederick challenge before I can say that for sure. It might be the case that she eventually loses out to enemy stat inflation, in which case the Dark Knight detour is likely a lot less worth it. The second seal gives you a lot of options for switching around. You can also use a second seal later to reclass into the other promoted options, so let's go ahead and discuss those next. War Cleric, I already mentioned, doesn't really play very well to Miriel's strengths, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But I will say that Rally Luck isn't the best rally, but it does synergize with Demoiselle. It gives additional evasion and crit avoid to nearby allies. Awakening is a game where stacking up all of these small evade, crit evade bonuses, they can yield tangible results, because your frontliners are going to be fighting 10 combats on enemy phase against super high quality threats. Renewal automatically heals you for a percentage of your HP at the start of each turn. This could be valuable on some characters, but again, like Dark Knight, it's not for Miriel. She is not the best candidate for War Cleric. For her, it's just a slower and less powerful version of Life Taker, which she already doesn't really want. So yeah, even a detour just to pick up skills, sadly, I think War Cleric is not the choice for Miriel. The main classes that I think compare very favorably against Sage, and they're in serious contention as options for both training, skill access, and even potential choices for Miriel's permanent class, are going to be Sorcerer and Valkyrie. We already discussed many of the strengths of Sorcerer early on with their unique access to dark magic. They're also, similar to the Dark Knight, a more bulky version of the Mage line, giving Miriel a bit more of a buffer to take enemy attacks without immediately folding. Also, if you want her partner to have a better defensive pair-up line, Sorcerer is better than this because Sage does not give any defensive stats. Vengeance is the single most reliable offensive skill in this game. It can be possible to make the activation rate 100% on certain builds, and otherwise it's close enough that it's practically guaranteed. And the amount of extra damage can be controlled by intentionally letting enemies hit Miriel first. It deals extra damage based on how much health Miriel is missing, so by allowing her to take a bit of damage early on and leaving her on low health, it gives her a massive firepower boost. Although this strategy is risky, of course. The other valuable thing Vengeance does is that if Miriel's health is low, her Nosferatu attacks will deal more damage, which is going to heal her for more damage as a result. Remember, Nosferatu can activate skills in this game, so it just works. At level 15, she's also going to get Tomebreaker, which will make her a devastating anti-mage unit, who can actually very reliably enemy phase sweep. We've talked about stacking these small bonuses in Awakening and how it's actually very good in this game. Well, the Breaker skills are the pinnacle of that philosophy. In this game, the Breaker skills are so effective. It can be very reasonable to drop enemy hit rates to single digits or even 0%. Adding on to this, the fact that enemies are still going to attack Miriel even if they have a 0% hit chance, and you've got a powerful option on your hands. Miriel's HP and resistance are not so high that she could completely ignore enemy mages normally, but Tomebreaker actually gives her serious value. If I was going to build Miriel as a primary combat unit, I would strongly consider going either Mage, Dark Mage, Sorcerer, or Mage, Sage to get Tome Fair, and then switch over to Sorcerer. I think Sorcerer is her best combat class, although it does lose access to stabs, so keep that in mind. You're essentially giving up her support power to make her a better combat unit, and stabs are good enough in Awakening that this is a serious opportunity cost, but you have to lean fully 100% into her identity as an amazing magical attacker, and you will be rewarded. Last on my list is Valkyrie. Now, if you liked what I said before about how Sage Miriel can be a strong attacker while still providing utility and support to the rest of the army, if you like that type of character, if you like that type of build, well, Valkyrie goes even further in the supporter direction. In fact, I would honestly say that Valkyrie Miriel barely loses any offense, but in exchange, she gains a horse, she gains more movement, and she gains access to some fantastic support skills. Even better is that unlike, say, Fire Emblem 8's split promotion trees, in Awakening, these are not mutually exclusive. So you can go Mage, Sage, and then Valkyrie, so that you get all of Valkyrie's awesome support and utility potential while still having the extra firepower from Tome Fair. However, you're giving up Demoiselle in that case if you don't go through Troubadour, so keep that in mind. Basically, Miriel is a unit with a ton of freedom that you can tailor to your specific preferences and needs. But I gotta say, basically every single version of the Miriel build is top tier. Going Mage, Troubadour, and then Valkyrie is just as valid. You're going to be a little bit weaker as an attacker, but you're going to be even stronger as a supporter. She is just such a great unit. I'm really surprised that nobody ever talks about her. So the Valkyrie class gets rally resistance, which is significantly better than rally luck. It's like dropping a ward staff on a whole group of nearby allies with a single action. And honestly, in this game, mages can be some of the most deadly and scariest enemies, and your best enemy phase sweepers are often lacking in resistance. The ability to buff all of their resistance stats with a single action is truly valuable. And finally, we get to talk about Dual Support Plus. This is the Valkyrie capstone skill, and another one of my personal favorite support skills in this game, really in the history of Fire Emblem. Basically, in Awakening, any characters who stand next to each other always get some kind of tiny bonus. This goes on a sliding scale from step 1 all the way up to step 15. Standing next to more people increases the bonus, and having a higher support level with each character also increases the bonus even further. Dual Support Plus adds a flat +4 to the step counter, and this essentially makes it like as if there was an additional A-rank support partner standing next to you all the time. I've talked about how much I appreciate the small hit and evade bonus skills and the auras in this game. Well, Dual Support Plus is like having multiple support skills active all at the same time with a single skill slot. Even better is that it also affects Miriel herself. So unlike Robin's Solidarity, which Robin cannot benefit from, Miriel could even boost her own crit rate by having Dual Support Plus active. She can reduce the chance of enemies critting her, and it's even like having Evade +10 from the Myrmidon class line, because it's going to reduce the chance of enemies hitting her. There is one downside to Dual Support Plus, compared to the other aura skills. It only affects the support bonus, and this does mean that Miriel will only affect the person she's paired up with, and the people standing immediately next to her. It doesn't buff the people standing 3 squares away, like Demoiselle, although it does stack with Demoiselle if you are standing next to someone. But if Miriel is rotated into the rear position, it's only going to affect her partner. It's not like the aura skills which broadcast away from her. Even with all of these considerations, seriously, do not underestimate Dual Support Plus, and do not underestimate Miriel as a unit. She can be one of the best support units, one of the best utility units, and one of the best offense units in the entire game. She can even be a mix of all three if built properly. She truly has unlimited potential, even in a no-grinding context. Speaking of potential, I don't want to talk too much about Laurent, because I think he should have his own video if I was going to talk about him. I'm just going to say that, again, characters in this game can still be fantastic even if they don't have Gale Force. One thing about Laurent that is notable is that you can easily pass down Dual Support Plus to him, making him another one of the best support partners in the game. And you can accomplish this by running a build that Miriel already wants to run. So there's no real opportunity cost. It doesn't make Miriel any worse as a unit, it only makes her son even stronger. What I will talk about are Miriel's potential partners. And here I want to talk about another beginner trap. One of the traps that people fall into whenever they're discussing Fire Emblem Awakening. It feels like we're on some forum and it's still the year 2006, and we're talking about which characters have the best cap stats for Apotheosis, and it's like, okay, so honestly, if you do want to talk about that, I think that's totally valid. It's totally fine, but you have to make that clear and you have to separate that discussion from what is actually good in the actual game. The other 99% of the game that is not Apotheosis. What build and what characters are going to help you get through Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 5, 6, 7, all of the difficult paralogue chapters, Chapter 9, 10, 11, 12, all of the extremely difficult early chapters. They do not care about your endgame capped stat build that you're trying to pass down to Laurent. I often think it's much less valuable to think about unit pairings in terms of how do I make the strongest version of Laurent, because he is a character who is going to join the game late and under-leveled. He could be extremely difficult to use in a no-grinding context, maybe even impossible. Rather, I think it's better to think about which character is going to make Miriel stronger immediately to help you with the hardest section of the game early on, or who can Miriel buff to make that character stronger. So first, we have to talk about Stahl. They join together in the same chapter, and I made a video recently where I explored these possible canon pairings in Awakening. What I did was look at the rate that characters gain support points with each other, and each character has one exclusive partner that they gain a super fast support with. In this case, Miriel and Stahl share a very special bond, allowing them to support faster than she can support with any other character. This allows them to obtain a C support immediately during their joining chapter, and it can represent a very early power spike for both characters. Stahl gives Miriel that extra little bit of bulk that she wants, and the Cavalier class, it even grants a little bit of extra speed. So when you get to C support, you're getting +2 speed from Stahl, and this can help a lot with her offense. Miriel admittedly gives less to Stahl, but they can at least dual strike for each other in the worst case scenario. Also, over time, Stahl commits to his oath in his S-rank support, and he becomes better and better at supporting Miriel. He has access to the Archer line, which is a great pair-up and dual striking class for any character, and he also has access to the Myrmidon line, which is surprisingly actually just as valuable for magical characters like Miriel as it would be for a physical character like Sully. As fast as Miriel is, she is not going to say no to getting even more speed, because it's going to allow her to double and remove the trickiest and the fastest enemies. One unique quality that Stahl has is that he gets access to Swordfare and Bowfare for hard-hitting dual strikes, and that's something that Frederick cannot do. Another thing is that if you don't want to use any second seals or committed resources on Stahl, you can still just promote him into Great Knight, because he's going to continue to give Miriel extra bulk and extra speed, and eventually the benefits of Dual Guard Plus, which is a pretty good bailout option. It's actually a shame that Stahl doesn't have access to Thief, because I think Trickster would actually go so hard as a Miriel pair-up option. Having said that, she does have a few other good potential options, so I want to talk about what each of the couples can do for both Miriel and what Miriel can do for each other characters, both in the short term and the long term. Because Virion is an archer, he's always going to be a decent option for pretty much any partner. However, I think him and Miriel together is actually the worst use of both of their potential. These two are actually more effective when you split them up, because they can do more chip damage actions per turn rather than having them paired together. And when you pair them up with other characters, they can bait in dual strikes from hard-hitting attackers like Frederick and Crom. Speaking of hard-hitting, let's talk about Vaike. Miriel and Vaike are actually great for each other. Vaike is capable of enemy phasing 1 range or even 1 to 2 range units on turns when Miriel didn't have enough bulk to stand in the lead. On the other hand, Miriel is capable of chipping at 2 range with cheaper, more reliable tomes in cases where Vaike doesn't have a good attack angle, his accuracy is too low, or you don't want to waste hand axe uses. They both bait in dual strikes from each other, and they're both offensively weighted characters, so it makes their dual strike potential very valuable. In the early game, this duo is surprisingly effective. Plus, you could either have Vaike or Miriel attack, then have somebody else grab the character who didn't attack, rotate them into the lead, and now that character still gets to attack the same enemy because they attack at different ranges. So Miriel attacks from 2 range, Vaike gets pulled into 1 range, Vaike attacks. Or Vaike attacks in 1 range, Miriel gets pulled into 2 range, and then Miriel attacks. And this is only discussing their early game benefits of fighting side by side. In the long run, they can do a surprisingly great job of supporting each other. I mentioned how good it would be if Stahl got access to Trickster. Well, Vaike actually gets this, and you might not imagine him as a sword-using unit, and honestly, him using a sword is barely relevant here. It's probably the worst use of his offensive potential. But the idea with this build is that if Vaike isn't getting trained as a primary combat unit anyway, you can make him into a character who boosts the speed and magic of Miriel. I don't think this is the best use of Vaike, and it's really just one way to get a little bit of extra value out of their pairing if you want to support Vaike and Miriel together for some reason. Having said that, even though this is a Miriel highlight video, I want to talk about what happens if you're trying to train Vaike as a primary combat unit, because Miriel helps him way more than the other way around. If you're going with the standard hero Vaike build, who is an enemy phase soul tank, one of his biggest blind spots is his relatively low resistance. With the right class line, Miriel can boost his resistance stat, and she dual strikes harder and more consistently than Lisa does. And Miriel can be rotated into the lead to attack in cases where you need a magical attacker. Oh, and on top of all of that, she also fixes Vaike's accuracy problems with Demoiselle, with Hex, with Anathema, and on top of all of that, with Dual Support Plus. So with a soul tanking strategy, you have two issues. Number one, you're sometimes going to get crit, which you really don't want. Dual Support Plus removes that chance. On top of that, sometimes soul is not going to activate and you need to rely on dodging at least a certain number of attacks. Dual Support Plus and Demoiselle make Vaike better at dodging attacks. It makes him less reliant on these soul activations to keep him alive and just makes him an even more consistent enemy phase sweeper. Honestly, this pairing is not ideal when it comes to passing down skills to Laurent. But if you're trying to maximize Vaike's potential as a carry, this is a very, very cost-effective strategy. Just have Vaike and Miriel fight together in the early game, and then just have Miriel stay paired up with Vaike for the rest of the game. On top of all of the other great things that Miriel can do, she can be a fantastic para partner. And she can do this for other characters, not just Vaike. Miriel and Kellam, for example, have a lot of the same advantages as pairing up with Vaike. However, Kellam does lack the enemy phase recovery as soul. But he does an arguably better job of supporting Miriel in return because he gives her more defense early on. And he has access to Monk, which gives a good pair-up stat line. And unlike Vaike, who's not very good in Trickster, I would say that Kellam is actually pretty good in Monk. We already talked about how Swordmaster and speed-weighted pair-ups are actually good for mages, and, well, look no further than Lonq. He will give Miriel a ton of extra speed and skill to help her double more often and crit more often. The fact that he could also access Trickster and is much better in this role than Stahl or Vaike is just a bonus. Ricken is a more tricky character to use with or without Miriel, but the only thing I will say is that he's similar to Virion. I think it would be better to split these two up rather than keeping them paired together. The one advantage of pairing Miriel and Ricken together is just hitting super hard with a massively buffed magic stat line. Honestly, if the mage class boosted speed, these two would actually make a great pair. But funny enough, Ricken has barely any option for boosting Miriel's speed, which is pretty sad. You have to rely on the Cavalier stat line, and it's not great. I would be curious to know if anyone in the world has ever run Cavalier Ricken and if it's actually better than Stahl, but that's dubious to me. Gaius is a very similar unit to Lonq, so I'm not going to tread the same water over and over again. He's actually very similar not only as a unit but also as a para partner for Miriel. Interestingly though, the one thing that sets Gaius apart from Lonq also makes him more similar to Vaike, because he does get access to Hero and the Soul skill. There might actually be some unexplored potential here. Gaius in general is a character that I want to talk about in the future, and I am working on a video for him as well. Now, Gregor's main advantage is that you get him for free, but because you've already had Miriel for a very long time and you wanted to be building support with her and her partner over the early course of the game, it's probably too late by the time that Gregor joins. Seriously, if you want to use Miriel in a no-grinding context, you need to pick one of her early options like Vaike, Lonq, Stahl, or Gaius and start building that support as soon as possible. But having said all that, in theory, she should be able to support Gregor in the same way that she would normally support Vaike, and Gregor has the potential to support Miriel in the same way that Lonq would support Miriel, so he is actually a valid choice. Speaking of late joiners, Henry strikes me as the type of character who would do split up from Miriel rather than being paired up with her, at least on a first glance. However, one thing I started to notice about this option is that it's a way for Miriel to get the benefit of Hex and Anathema without needing to go through the Dark Mage class line herself. This is the same benefit that Saria gives to Robin. Even if Miriel eventually ends up in Sorcerer, she can get the Hex and Anathema benefit from Henry instead. Henry could even use Dark Knight or Trickster to boost Miriel's movement stat if she needs a good magical para partner to boost her movement. Honestly, if you planned this out from the beginning and you knew what you were doing, I could actually see these two having some serious potential together. Libra is the option that I've explored the least, so I don't want to talk about something that I'm not entirely sure about myself. It's funny that this guy is always, and I mean always, on my team because of how strong he is and how useful and how you get him for free. And yet, because he's typically an unpaired staff bot and he joins later, I rarely think about who to support him with. As much as I've played this game, and I've even done runs with grinding aloud to explore the massive depth of the mechanics like one giant sandbox to see what does and doesn't work, the reality is that I'm not going to sit here and play through the game 10 times in a row for the sole purpose of pairing Miriel up with every character and seeing through personal experience which ones work better than others. I can use my experience that I do have and the knowledge of the numbers and the game mechanics to get an idea of how she would work with other specific characters. So you're gonna have to forgive me if I didn't miss anything, or let me know if there's any detail that I overlooked, maybe something you noticed or something that stands out in an actual personal experience and gameplay. On that note, I really want to talk about Lonq in a future video, but I know that when I ran my character poll recently, people were by far the most interested in Vaike. So I'm kind of curious to know which videos you people really want to see. Do you even like this kind of character discussion, or would you rather I talk about other things? It's always nice for me to get feedback from other people because it helps me come up with other ideas, but I think I've rambled on long enough on this one. Sub to the channel if you don't want to miss the next video, where I'm likely gonna yap for another 40 minutes about some obscure game mechanics. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.